This is Dr. Stansel with a lecture on argument evaluation. Let's begin by recalling the function of an argument. What is its job? Its job is to give rational justification for a point of view. Or another way to say that is to state premises which support the conclusion. When we evaluate an argument, or when we do argument evaluation, or just evaluation, we are asking how well the argument did its job. So specifically, we're asking, do the premises adequately support the conclusion? Some arguments fail to support their conclusion because a key premise is false or not believable. So, when you are asked to evaluate an argument, this is one approach you can take. If you believe that the argument fails to support its conclusion because it has a weak premise, which is either false or not believable, then you would want to apply what I am calling evaluative strategy 1. And to apply this strategy, first you identify the key premises of the argument, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. It's a very important step. And from the key premises, you identify one key premise that is either false or not believable. You explain why, and then you conclude that the argument fails to support its conclusion. On the next couple of slides, I'll walk you through how this would work and show you how it would look. Here's an example, and I will eventually be evaluating this sample argument using evaluative strategy 1. But first, let's just read the argument. Premise 1, about 25 million farm animals are slaughtered each day in the U.S. Premise 2, animals suffer when slaughtered. Premise 3, the meat industry causes enormous suffering. Premise 4, we are morally required to reduce suffering when we can. Premise 5, eating meat is part of our culture. Premise 6, but it is not necessary to eat meat. Conclusion, vegetarianism is morally required. So if you want to apply evaluative strategy 1 here, the first thing to do is go through premise by premise and try to identify which premises are non-essential or merely secondary, and which ones are really key to the argument. So remembering that the job of the premises is to support the conclusion. Which of these premises are really important in supporting the conclusion, and which are much less important? So looking at premise 1, which states that about 25 million farm animals are slaughtered each day in the U.S., this premise is not very important for the conclusion. What if only 1 million farm animals were slaughtered a day? Or what if only 100 farm animals were slaughtered? The rest of the argument would still stand. Let's look at P2. Animals suffer when slaughtered. Regardless of the number of animals, this premise would still be true, and this is the one that's really important when it's placed together with P4 and P6. So on the slide, I have used the asterisk to label the key premises, and I've written key P. So these three, P2, P4, and P6, are really important to making the argument work, but not P1. So let's see, let's go down. So P2 I've said is really important, that animals suffer when slaughtered. P3, I have not labeled that one as a key premise because it's actually repetitive. P2 already said animals suffer when slaughtered. P3 says much the same thing in a slightly different way. So it's not a really important premise. But when we go to P4, which states we are morally required to reduce suffering when we can, this premise is very, very important because it identifies a moral obligation that we have, and specifically a moral obligation related to suffering. This works together with the P2, which said animals suffer when slaughtered. Okay, P5, eating meat is part of our culture. Well, yes and no. I mean, it depends on, the U.S. is really a diverse nation, and there are many different cultural groups living here. In some of those groups, people don't eat as much meat. Anyway, this premise is not really necessary to the conclusion. Even if it weren't true, the rest of the argument would still stand. So I haven't marked this one. But P6 is very important. It states it is not necessary to eat meat. This works together with P4. Let's look at that one again. We are morally required to reduce suffering when we can. So if someone has to eat meat to live, then they won't be required to stop eating meat because it causes animal suffering. But P6 says, really it says nobody needs to eat meat. And so when you take P2, P4, and P6 all together, they provide the important support for the conclusion that vegetarianism is morally required. Okay, if you are asked to do an argument evaluation and you think that you want to try to apply evaluative strategy number 1, the first step that you'll have to do is going through premise by premise like I just did and thinking about which of the premises are really important to the argument and which could be cut, which ones are repetitive, or which ones just don't matter as much. And you will want to mark the key premises before you go on to the next step in this evaluative strategy. To apply evaluative strategy 1, I want to show that a key premise of the argument is false or not believable. And I really do need to pinpoint a key premise, because if I pick one of the non-essential or less important premises and show that that premise is not believable, it probably won't matter to the argument. As long as the key premises are still solid, that argument is going to be considered successful. So if I want to show that the argument is not successful, I need to attack one of the key premises. So that's what's happening here in this example of an evaluation write-up. This is what you would actually write for me if I ask you to perform argument evaluation on a homework assignment or in a test. All you have to do is pinpoint the key premise that you want to show is false or not believable, explain why it's false or not believable, and then conclude that the argument has failed. So in this paragraph, the key premise that I've chosen to attack was premise 2. Let me read it and we'll talk about it. It is not true that animals suffer when slaughtered. Most modern slaughterhouses use a technique that is quick and painless. Therefore, the argument fails to support its conclusion. This is it. This is the evaluation. It's short, it's sweet, but it does have the elements that I really need to see. First of all, I state that that premise 2 is not true. I didn't use the label premise 2. It's okay if you do. If you'd like to name the premise like that in your paragraph, that's fine. But what I have done in my paragraph here is I have restated the contents of that premise, which said animals suffer when slaughtered. And I've spelled out, it is not true that animals suffer when slaughtered. And then I have explained why. Why is it not true? Well, because most modern slaughterhouses use a technique that's quick and painless. So after providing that explanation, I conclude my paragraph by saying, therefore, the argument fails to support its conclusion. And you do need to say that, because while you might think it's obvious to you, it's not always obvious to your reader. So be very clear and let the reader know that you think that for the reasons you just stated, the argument fails to support its conclusion. And then once you've done that, you are done. This is considered a complete evaluation. I'd like to say a little bit more about how you should go about trying to show that a premise is false or not believable. And a really important rule of thumb is here in the first bullet. Don't just say that the author doesn't give enough support for the premise. Notice that when you say the author doesn't adequately support this premise, therefore it's not believable and the argument fails to support its conclusion. This is a really generic evaluation that if I allowed it, if it was acceptable, it would work for any argument in the whole course because it's not at all specific. It's a completely generic approach. That's one reason I consider it a cheap shot. But it's also not fair to evaluate an argument this way because when we are evaluating arguments, we are expecting that the author provide good, strong support for the conclusion. But we don't expect the author to provide support for each individual premise of the argument. And in general terms, the reason we don't require that is because across the board, it would make all arguments very, very long. Authors want to write to be readable. They want their work to be accessible. And so there will be a lot of premises that they don't pause and give evidence for. This is a practical consideration. It would just make the piece of writing way too long, so we don't expect it. And also, absence of support isn't in and of itself a reason to doubt the premise. The premise could definitely be true, even if the author didn't provide any specific support for that premise. So, how should you go about trying to show that a premise is false or not believable? Well, the burden of proof is on you. You need to provide a specific reason why we should doubt the premise. You need to point out something wrong with what the premise actually says. So judge a premise on what it says, not on how much support the author did or did not provide for it. And so if you'll go back a slide and look at my example again, you'll see that in explaining why that premise was not believable, I did address specifically what the premise claimed and gave a reason why we should not believe that claim. And that's how I want you to approach strategy 1. There's another strategy that you can use. I'm calling this evaluative strategy 2, and you would want to use this strategy when all the premises are true, but they still don't support the conclusion. And so, in order to apply this strategy, you first, in step 1, state that you accept that all premises are true. You can also say, suppose for the sake of argument that all the premises are true. And then in step 2, you explain why the premises, even though they're all true, are still not adequate to support the conclusion. And you will have to explain why they are inadequate. And most typically, you need to show there's some kind of gap or leap between the premises and the conclusion. Finally, you conclude that the argument fails to support its conclusion. Here's a sample argument. On the next slide, I'll use strategy 2 to evaluate this argument. The argument says, all students deserve the same chance at a good grade. They should be given the same assignments and tests. High quality work should get a high grade. Low quality work should get a low grade. Late penalties cause high quality work to get a lower grade. Therefore, late penalties are wrong. And here's an evaluation of that argument using strategy 2. I'd like you to just pause the lecture here and read through this evaluation at your own pace. Evaluations using strategy 2 can vary greatly because there are a lot of different arguments out there and they can be missing different kinds of things. And so for this strategy, I wanted to give you one more example of the strategy in use. And so here's a sample argument. Let me have you pause the lecture and read this. And then on the next slide, I'll apply strategy 2 in evaluating this argument. Okay, here's my evaluation using strategy 2. And again, I just ask that you pause the lecture and read through this. Like I said, evaluations using strategy 2 can vary greatly depending on the original argument being evaluated and what we think is wrong with it. But whenever we apply strategy 2, we need these elements, okay? You need to state that all the premises of the original argument are true. You need to state that the premises do not adequately support the conclusion. And then, this is really important, you need to describe the gap or the leap that exists between the premises and the conclusion. And this means you need to describe what's missing. So a good way to start is to summarize what the premises do say and then specifically describe what's missing. Don't just say there's a gap between the premises and conclusion. It's not enough to do that. You need to convince your reader that there's a gap, and the only way to do that is to describe what's missing. And I think the examples I provided both do that. So please take a look at those again. And of course, message me with any questions you might have. If you think there's a gap between the premises and the conclusion and something is missing, explain why. Okay, that's the bottom line here. If you're concerned about this argument, you doubt the argument, you think that it fails because something important is missing, say what that is. And then finally conclude by stating that the argument fails to support its conclusion. Suppose you read an argument and you find that it's very strong, and in your evaluation, you want to show that the argument succeeds in supporting its conclusion. Then you can use evaluative strategy 3, which is described on the slide, and I'll talk you through now. In this strategy, you'll support the argument with additional argumentation. Your goal will be to show that key premises of the argument are true or believable. Let me talk you through how to apply this strategy. First, you need to identify the key premises. These are the premises that are really necessary for the conclusion. Many arguments will have one or more premises that are additional or supplemental. They aren't really essential. And so you'll want to pass those over and focus on the key premises of the argument. And then for each key premise, you need to provide a short original argument supporting your view that the premise is true or believable. This argument should be very short, just one or two, perhaps three premises. It needs to be original. You can't replicate arguments or the argument made in the argument that you're evaluating, because that's not helpful. What you're doing when you apply this strategy is you're bringing new ideas, new reasoning to support the argument and give your proof that this is a strong argument. So you do need to bring new content. The third bullet point here says avoid restating content of the target argument. It's just not helpful to do that. You'll conclude your evaluation by stating that the argument succeeds in supporting its conclusion. Now, this evaluative strategy can be labor intensive when you have an argument that has several key premises, but you really do need to support each one, because after all, if all of the key premises aren't true and believable, then this argument might not, in fact, succeed in supporting its conclusion. When you apply evaluative strategy 3, your goal is to show that the argument succeeds in supporting its conclusion. And to do that using this strategy, you need to show that each key premise is true or believable. And the way to do that is to provide a short argument for each one. Here's the sample argument that I'll be evaluating on the following slides using evaluative strategy 3. It's a good idea to pause the lecture and take a few minutes to read through this argument. I just want to note that I have marked all of the premises as key premises except P2 and P3, and that's because P2 and P3 are there as a mini argument embedded within the larger argument, and they support P4. So P2 and P3 constitute a mini argument for P4. That's why I have identified them as not key premises. Although they're not fluff, they're not nothing, they are important, but for the purposes of evaluating this argument, it's enough if I will provide additional short original arguments for P1, P4, and P5. P2 and P3, because they're in a supportive role and they don't directly support the conclusion itself, rather they're supporting P4, I have not marked those as key premises. And in applying the evaluative strategy, I would not have to provide additional short arguments in support of P2 and P3. Here's the sample answer, and it's quite long. This strategy can often be lengthy to apply. The sample answer goes over 4 slides. There won't be audio on the next 3 slides, just on this one. I just want you to read the sample answer. And as you do that, be looking for how this sample answer contains 3 short arguments. One of them is in support of P1 of the original argument, one of them is in support of P4, and one of them is in support of P5. And if you read carefully, you'll be able to find and identify those. That's the same kind of approach you would want to take when using this evaluative strategy for any argument. Here's another strategy you can use when you believe that an argument fails to support its conclusion. And this strategy I can only describe in a very general sense, but it is to show that the argument commits a fallacy. You may study fallacies such as the fallacy of circularity, fallacy of false dichotomy, straw man fallacy in your course. There are a great many fallacies in the field of philosophy and that an instructor might include in a course. If an argument commits a fallacy, it fails to support its conclusion. So the evaluative strategy here is to show how the argument commits a fallacy and then to conclude, therefore, this argument fails to support its conclusion. Only use this strategy with fallacies that have been taught in the course. Please don't bring in fallacies that you have studied elsewhere or that you have learned in a different course. That there may be just a variety of reasons that they won't work or that they won't really be appropriate. So I ask students to stick to the content that I have taught. If I do provide instruction on fallacies, then you can use what you know about those fallacies and you can apply this evaluative strategy if you think it would be relevant, if you think it would work. If I don't teach about any fallacies in a semester, then don't use this strategy. Now that I've gone through the 3 evaluative strategies that you have to choose from when I ask you to evaluate an argument, let me say a few words about what argument evaluation is not. It is not the time to make your own argument about the topic. It is not the time to give your view of the conclusion. And an evaluation of an argument is not an evaluation of the conclusion. Rather, it's an evaluation of whether the premises of the argument adequately support the conclusion. And if you'll go back through my examples where I show you evaluations using each of the 3 strategies, you'll see in none of those sample evaluations do you actually learn my view on the conclusion of the argument. You just see whether I think the argument succeeds or fails in supporting its conclusion. When I ask you to evaluate an argument, many strong answers are possible. First of all, you've seen that there are 3 different evaluative strategies, but even with those 3 strategies, they can each be applied in different ways. So there's really a wide range of acceptable answers. When I'm grading your work, I'm looking to see whether you applied one of the 3 evaluative strategies that I taught, and whether you applied it correctly and effectively. So I'm looking to see whether your evaluation works. Does it target a key element of the argument? Um, you should be really careful to not target irrelevant content or fluff. Some arguments do contain some fluff. It's content that the author included, but it's not really necessary to supporting the conclusion. So if you attack content which is not really necessary to supporting the conclusion, the rest of the argument might still give adequate support for the conclusion. So when you do argument evaluation, make sure you're pinpointing key important content of the argument, and that's what you're looking at. Your evaluation should be well explained, and the comments you make should be directly relevant to whether that argument succeeds in supporting its conclusion.